Tomatoes are one of the first vegetables that come to mind when we think about gardening. And that's for a really good reason, because of the incredible taste of a ripe, fresh-picked tomatoes. If you've never grown your own tomatoes before, you might have noticed that tomatoes from the local garden stand taste fresher. And you know what? If you grow your own, they're even better. Now, tomatoes are technically fruit, not vegetables, but that's a story for another day. There are so many different kinds of tomatoes that you can grow, and Tomato Breeders has given us access to hundreds, maybe even thousands of different choices. So how do we choose what we should grow? First off, tomato plants fall into one of two different categories: determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. Determinate tomato plants have been bred to yield all their tomatoes in a very short period of time. In other words, these plants grow a few feet tall and then they stop. They flower and they set tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes are popular with farmers who want everything to come in at the same time, and with people who want to make tomato sauce, because all the tomatoes are ready to harvest in a 2 to 3 week period, which is perfect for canning. We've been making our own tomato sauce from the tomatoes we've grown. Last year we made so much that our tomato sauce lasted us all the way through the winter and until June. Indeterminate tomatoes, on the other hand, don't stop growing until the weather gets too cold in the fall. They just keep going and growing and flowering and producing tomatoes. Indeterminate tomato plants give us tomatoes more gradually and over a much longer period of time. These plants can get really tall, so we may have to cut them down to make sure we can reach the fruit. I usually let my indeterminate tomato plants get to be 6 to 7 feet tall, and then I cut the tops back so that I can reach everything. Now, tomato plants are incredibly easy to grow, and one reason is that they can sprout roots from literally any part of their stems. When I first transplant tomatoes from indoors to their outdoor home in the garden, I usually bury as much of the stem as I can, because more roots will sprout from whatever I bury. More roots means greater access to water and nutrients, which gives a bigger plant and hopefully more tomatoes. Tomato plants also need support because they're going to collapse under their own weight when they get to be over a foot tall. You can use tomato cages, which work with determinate tomatoes, but indeterminate tomatoes will quickly get too tall for these cages. I've tried a lot of different support methods for tomatoes and have found that horizontal netting, spaced 12 to 16 inches apart, provides the support that my tomatoes need. A few layers is all that's needed for my determinate tomatoes, but I can use 4 or 5 layers of netting for indeterminate tomatoes that get much taller. There are lots of different varieties of tomatoes that you can grow, and I usually grow 3 or 4 different kinds in my garden each year. Now, I like cherry tomato plants because they come in first. When my kids were little, and now my grandkids love cherry tomatoes because they can pick and eat a tomato right off the plant, and they love to sneak over and snag a few cherry tomatoes when they think I'm not looking. And cherry tomato plants are prolific. I only need one plant and end up with all the cherry tomatoes I can handle. In fact, we can even lose a few to birds and chipmunks, and it really doesn't matter because there are so many. I also like to grow a beefsteak variety of tomato every year because, to me, there's something special about being able to cover an entire slice of bread with one single slice of tomato. Beefsteak tomatoes come in later because they get so big, but to me, it's worth the wait. And lately, we've gotten into making tomato sauce and canning, or should I say, jarring tomato sauce to use throughout the fall and winter. I've been growing Roma type tomatoes, which are oblong and have a lot of flesh and are perfect for tomato sauce. Last year, I grew about 10 Roma tomato plants, and we got close to 30 quarts of tomato sauce from them. And lastly, I usually try a new variety that I've never grown before. This year, I'm trying a second variety of Roma tomatoes, and between the 2 varieties I have double the number of tomato plants compared to last year, and we'll probably get a lot more tomato sauce. Grape tomatoes are a kind of a cross between a Roma tomato and a cherry tomato, but honestly, I think grape tomatoes came into popularity because they keep for longer in the grocery store. I tried growing a couple varieties of grape tomatoes in my garden a few years back, and honestly, the tomatoes I harvested from my garden tasted about the same as the ones I could buy in the grocery store. And they just didn't have that fresh picked taste that I was expecting. So, as my father-in-law used to say, I've tried growing grape tomatoes twice, the first time and the last time. Now, if you've had a different experience with grape tomatoes, I'd love it if you'd share it down in the comments section. And then there are just the plain old regular tomatoes, and there are tons of different varieties of them. If you're just starting out, you're probably going to get your tomato plants from the garden center nearby. In that case, you'll choose from what they have available, which will probably be okay. Now, if you have the time to start tomatoes from seed indoors, you'll have a lot more options available to you. When looking through catalogs or when shopping online, you'll probably see varieties that are specific for greenhouse growers, and you don't want to get those. Try what looks good to you and see how things turn out. Remember, gardening is experimenting, seeing what works, learning and getting smarter every year. Now, regardless of whether you buy seeds or plants, follow the recommendations they give you for plant spacing. Determinate tomatoes need less room because they don't get as big, but be sure to leave plenty of room for your indeterminate tomato plants. Tomatoes are a summer crop, so you can't put them out in an unprotected garden too early. If the weather's too cold at night, your tomatoes will just sit there waiting for the temperatures to warm up and they won't do anything. If the temperatures go below 40 at night, you run the risk of damaging your plants, and if the temperatures go below freezing, you might lose them. I live in hardiness zone 6A, so I usually wait until between May 15th and Memorial Day to plant my tomatoes outside. Tomatoes need hot weather to really spring to life, and the weather in the United States gets hot enough for everyone to be able to grow tomatoes. Well, I should correct myself because I learned when visiting Alaska that people there need to grow tomatoes in greenhouses because it just doesn't get hot enough for long enough during the summer there. I'm told the same is true in England, that it just doesn't get hot enough there and tomatoes have to be grown in greenhouses where the temperatures get hotter. All tomatoes have what are called suckers, which is growth that sprouts wherever a leaf connects into the stem. And there are different schools of thought on whether to let the suckers grow or whether it's better to remove them. So of course, the scientist in me said, hey, let me do an experiment to see if I could see what the difference was. I grew 2 cherry tomato plants side by side one summer. With one, I picked off and removed all the suckers, and with the other, I let all the suckers grow. Which plant did better? Well, the answer is, it depends. It depends on what you want. The plant where I picked off all the suckers gave me tomatoes that were bigger and that came in about a week earlier, but I didn't get as many tomatoes from that plant. The plant where I let the suckers grow gave me smaller tomatoes that came in a little bit later, but I got a lot more tomatoes and they came in for longer. So you decide what's most important to you and treat your plants accordingly. As your tomato plants get taller, the lower leaves may start to turn yellow. They might develop spots, and if left alone, they may turn brown and maybe even fall off all on their own. There are lots of different reasons for this, but don't worry about it too much. It's a good idea to remove the leaves that aren't green if you can. Here are some of the potential causes for these conditions. First, the plant naturally will shift its energy toward the most rapidly growing parts of the plant, which is the top or canopy of the plant and the tomatoes. Right? It also spends a lot of energy doing its job, which is to make tomatoes. So the lower leaves get less light because they're shielded, and they're eventually going to yellow and brown, and they may even dry up and fall off. Second, if the leaves get wet every time the plant is watered, it's not uncommon for bacteria or fungus to grow on the leaves because of all the water and all the heat. You'll see brown or black spots on your leaves, and the leaves will also eventually yellow. Another clue that the plant is getting too wet is if you see these brown or black spots growing on the stem of the plant. Too much water can cause this condition as well. Third, if your plants are too close together, there won't be enough air movement between plants, and the moisture doesn't get a chance to evaporate enough, which will give bacteria or fungus a foothold, and the leaves will start to develop brown or black spots. There are a few other causes, but these are the most common. So, if you find some of the lower leaves starting to get yellow, get spots, or turn brown, snip them off to keep your plant green and healthy. You'll stop the plant from spending its energy trying to save a leaf that's eventually going to die and fall off anyways.